U.S. Trade Representative Jamieson Greer was in the hot seat today after the U.S. announced 50% tariffs on Canada. Greer was appearing before a Senate Finance Committee, and some Democratic senators had some questions.
When the new tariff on Canada takes effect, will Canada have higher tariffs than China on some products?
On a small handful, China's by far much higher than Canada overall.
And how are you approaching the risk of retaliatory tariffs from Canada now that you've imposed 50% duties on a wide range of products?
I talked with my Canadian counterpart yesterday. They did not say they're going to retaliate.
Our tourism is down about 40%. We really value our relationship with Canada, both emotionally and financially.
We're trying to balance this relationship, have as much trade, liberal trade in North America as possible while protecting our producers. It's not going to happen overnight.
What do you view as a realistic timeline for conclusion of the USMCA negotiations that are currently underway?
I would love to have between now and the end of the year at least some arrangements, one with Canada, one with Mexico.
CBC News caught up with Jamieson Greer after that hearing to ask about the timing of these new higher tariffs. Here was his response.
Canada has had its retaliatory measures in place on us for at least a year. Things like dairy have been discriminatory against the United States for even longer than that. We have tried for over a year to get the Canadians to eliminate these things. Again, we've given them the best treatment available in the world in the past year or so, and despite that, they've still taken these actions, so we thought it was necessary to elevate this.
Time now for the Power Panel. Amanda Alvaro is a former Liberal Party communications strategist, and in our Ottawa studios, keeping it safe in my absence, we have Tim Powers, who has worked as a strategist for Conservative parties, and Jordan, who's in charge. Jordan Likeness, she's a former NDP strategist. It's good to see you all. Jordan, just start with you because you're the boss. What Jamieson Greer said there is like, oh, we've tried to get them to get rid of these retaliatory tariffs for a year. Well, there's a way to do that. And we've given them preferred access because of CUSMA, and now we felt it was time to escalate things because we don't like where it's going. I mean, what do you make of what we heard there from the U.S. Trade Representative?
Well, certainly an interesting fantasy world that he's living in, but I think it gives you an insight into the thought process that's happening with those around the president. Look, I think that the imposition of these tariffs, of course, have very little, if nothing, to do with what Canada has or has not done, and a great deal to do with the political trouble that Trump and MAGA are in the United States leading up to the midterm elections. The provocation for Trump's attacks on Canada have almost always been domestic political pressures. It's a tool that he turns to change the channel. And Canada is one of his favorite punching bags when things are not looking good for him. So I think that this is no exception to that rule. Of course, the grievances that we heard about there in that interview are these are well-known, long-standing things for the most part that really are neither here nor there when it comes to negotiation of the broader trade agreement. And I think that there's a lot to suggest, particularly the 30 days that Trump has given for these to come into force, that things could move within that time period.
Amanda, what are your thoughts on that? Because, again, this latest move by the U.S. is a retaliation on a retaliation because they started it. And again, they seem surprised by the consequences of their actions. So where do you think this leaves things with this countdown clock that Canada says maybe could lead to some sort of an arrangement, but then Jamieson Greer in a committee end of year, 2027?
Right. I mean, yeah, so many messages, so many mixed signals. I'm inclined to think this is about Canada today, but not about Canada. And I think, obviously context matters. You go back to a year ago when Trump was able to fill up the U.S. Treasury, and then the Supreme Court makes its ruling, that Treasury starts to dry up, and he has to tell the American people that he's still going to make good on his promise to increase those revenues. And so he goes to Section 122. He takes his next step, which allows him to impose 10% tariffs globally. But they have a 150-day expiration date, and that expiration date is coming, this Friday. So then he takes his next opportunity, which is to go all the way back to like an almost century-old trade section, Section 338, which he used to impose these 50% tariffs on Canada. But again, this is centuries old. It's never been used in modern era trade policy. It's likely to face legal scrutiny. There's obviously already questions about how it contravenes CUSMA. So there's all kinds of problems around it. And the undercurrent of which we have this subtext, which is, oh, but on the sidelines, you're retaliating against us. We're doing everything we can to get to the end of the deal. And it just feels like a lot of jockeying of position before they're able to reach a new agreement, whatever that might look like.
Yeah, I don't think it's centuries old. It's almost a century old. It's 1930, right?
Sorry,
that's 90.
Century old. Sorry.
Yeah. Tim, that's 96 years, right? I think, if I do the math right, because that's the Smoot-Hawley legislation, which was so successul it helped bring on the Great Depression and killed global trade by 65%.
Exactly.
So Tim, like the other tariffs, the 10% tariff is going to probably go away Friday. Others will come on stream. They might be the 308s. I don't know if I'm getting my legislation or my ammunition mixed up. But what are your thoughts on what Greer had to say and sort of what this all tells us about where the CUSMA stuff is?
Come on, it's a 307. You should know that. And thank you for not saying I'm 100 years old, being the oldest person here. Look,
I was implying it.
I got that. I'm sure most of the audience did as well. But look, Friday, before all of this, Friday was the fires, right? Last Friday was the fires.
Right.
There's been a steady stream of things, and he hasn't moved off the fires. And by the way, Americans, if you're watching, DM me. I got a basement full of hockey sticks. I can get to you before August 19th. I mean, it all seems to be about distraction. It's hard not to suggest that it is that. I agree with Jordan. I agree with Amanda on that. It doesn't seem that they're having the desired impact that they want to divide and conquer yet. You're in PEI, you're talking to these premiers. Well, there might be, some frustration from Doug Ford that he feels he's doing more than other premiers. This isn't the beginning of all of this, which you will well recall when Danielle Smith was on one side and Doug Ford was on another. They, in fact, seem tighter on all of this. Listening to Premier Lance today, I noted again, he was asked a question about potatoes and would they be impacted. And he said, we've had maybe 1% of the impact of the tariffs has been on us. Others have suffered more. That unity of purpose, if it's doing anything, it's making Mark Carney stronger at home. And there's a lot of public data to suggest that. Nobody is saying capitulate. Nobody is saying no, run away from all of this. Yes, there's frustration that there's not a deal, but there's more people saying, look at the Abacus poll from yesterday, it's over 60%. No, don't do a deal. Don't concede. And as long as the Prime Minister has that, he can politically wait. The question is what the economic damage is going to be over time, particularly if you're in the autos or the steel sector. So, those are all the things he's trying to balance. But if Donald Trump is trying to divide and conquer Canadians in hopes that will get him a deal, that's not working.
It's interesting, though, these most recent tariffs that have been put on the table, the analysis I've seen from some economists that the federal government has done and the provinces have done here is that they really target British Columbia, Ontario and Quebec. Where there is no booze, and spares Saskatchewan and Alberta where there is booze, which is an interesting thing. So the premiers are united on the destination. There may be some disagreement on the journey, but they are united, and they want to hear from Prime Minister Mark Carney, who's arriving.
Sorry, I was just going to say on that point, it's interesting. Yeah, I was just going to say on that polling. On the polling, it shows Quebec and Ontario and even in British Columbia, they're the ones that say go hard against Donald Trump. So it may be economically targeted there, but right now the polling data is saying, whatever, you hit us as hard as you want. We're not backing down.
Yeah, I mean, we'll see. As I understand it, I think the Prime Minister has landed in Charlottetown. His plane is here. He's going to go to a gala, as they call it, with the premiers tonight, and then they're going to have their face-to-face meeting tomorrow. And premier after premier after premier said that they want to know Mark Carney's plan, at least in broad strokes, to respond to these new U.S. tariffs. Have a listen.
We need a Team Canada approach led by the Prime Minister. And if he doesn't want to lead it with the other premiers, then I can't do it alone. I feel some days that I'm standing alone protecting Canada, and I need everyone else to get on side.
We need to be frank with the Americans that they will not get the kind of access that they seek to what's in Canada if this is how the conduct's going to go. If the Prime Minister calls British Columbia and says he needs support with some big sticks to have conversations at the table, then we'll be there.
It's in everyone's best interest in North America, the entirety of North America, for us to come to agreement in a reviewed and renewed CUSMA. I am bullish that we will be able to find that in the near term. However, I'm not entirely confident that we will.
So, Jordan, I'm not trying to create a narrative of fake drama and division, because that's not what it is. But there is some disagreement, right, on just how hard to go and which levers to pull in your leverage play. But what do you make of what we're hearing from the premiers here, right, where Doug Ford says, let's go, and people like Smith and Miller are like, calm down, man. We're not putting our oil and potash in play.
Well, this is certainly a repetition of a dynamic that we've seen among the premiers since the beginning of the tariff fight. There's always been different analyses and appetites in terms of fighting back, in terms of whether things like energy should be on the table as a potential retaliatory measure. But I think what you can say in this circumstance is that, we've learned a few things with this episode. And the first is that preemptive concessions to the Americans don't work. They are not protective. So Canada gave away on the digital services tax, on the online streaming, more recently on the Gordie Howe Bridge. They flexed in order to get a deal there. And that wasn't protective. In the end, he came in with these new tariffs regardless. Second thing we've learned, and that's based on the list of things that are not being tariffed in this new initiative, is where the leverage points are. What are the things that the U.S. is getting from Canada, things like critical minerals, energy, potash, that they think that they really need? So that's also a list of things, of course, that Canada has at its disposal to decide to send or not. And I think that this is important, and this is what's in the mix. And so you have different premiers who have different analyses about whether or not that leverage should be tapped into. But I would say that the language that we're hearing from the premiers, particularly Premier Eby, and of course Premier Ford, who has been from the start more bullish on this, is much stronger. There is, we're now having more conversations about the potential of retaliation. And as we heard in the congressional hearings, retaliatory tariffs and retaliatory measures do get the Americans' attention. And in fact, over the course of the last year, that has been one of the only things that has consistently gotten the attention of the Americans. So I think it's a very worthwhile debate for the premiers to be having about whether it's time to tap into those tools.
Yeah, I mean, Jordan's dead on the analysis of they've shown where the vulnerabilities are. They're not too worried in the United States, it seems, about cutting off their supply of hockey sticks. But, they are worried about potash and critical minerals and energy. But if the premiers in the provinces where those are the dominant economic pieces have made it very clear these are not options, how worried are the Americans going to be about that as potential leverage?
Well, there's things that I think earlier on we thought were smaller things like alcohol, which turned out not to be so small. So I think that there's different levers that have been pulled, that can be pulled. And I think that you always have that stick in the back, which is the big concerns for the U.S. But right now, I think there's two things going on. One, there's how the premiers are communicating directly to their provinces for their own political interests. And there's how the premiers show up as part of the federation, how they show up arm in arm, stronger in numbers, more united front as we head into this negotiation. What they have at their back is what Tim mentioned, which is data. We know that Canadians are backing this effort. We know that Canadians want to see a united front on this topic, especially in BC, Ontario, and Quebec. So they have the ability to rely on the sentiment in their home provinces, on how Canadians are feeling about this, in order to take a stand that is maybe, pushing those limits a little harder than they would have otherwise. But, do they end up putting critical minerals on the table? I think we're a long ways away from something like that.
Tim, what are your thoughts on that? And what do you think the Prime Minister needs to kind of say to the premiers tomorrow? Because they've all expressed confidence in his leadership and his approach, that he keeps them in the loop, but they want to see a plan.
Well, that's probably going to mean some more federal spending and helping out in areas where they have helped out, in other areas that may become targeted. They've done that. I suspect he'll talk about that. What will be really interesting is what is Canada thinking about in terms of the U.S. midterms? Not advocating here that somehow we, launch an ad campaign and interfere in the election. That would be a terrible thing to do, David. But
Reagan ad, maybe something like that.
Well, that might be foreign interference on the other side of the border, and we don't want that trouble. But the teasing of that aside, what happens in November? Does his perspective change? Maybe it doesn't, but I think there's an element of time here. I think the other thing that the provinces are going to want to see from the federal government is perhaps more of an overt, among themselves, coordination strategy. Can you take, other premiers like David Eby and send him down to the Western governors? Can you take Tim Houston and Wakeham and Susan Holt and Rob Lance and send them down to the New England governors? Because if Doug Ford is right in what he said to you and that the ground is shifting on the ground, put the premiers to use. If they're active and engaged and telling the story of their challenges and their opportunities, better to have busy hands than idle ones, as is oft said, and we know what happens with idle hands. I think the other thing the Prime Minister has to say is that I am prepared to retaliate, but it would have to be quite a grievous set of circumstances. Because on the oil, the last thing I'd say is, as you well know, being from an oil receiving provinces, generating provinces, you and I both are, then they don't necessarily want to mess with that domestically because of the revenue that it produces for federal and provincial coffers. So, do you do something to spite yourself?
Yeah, and with what is going on politically in Alberta, boy, that would be quite a thing to do. Jordan, so your thoughts on just, what is it Mark Carney you expect him to say tomorrow, or what you think? What do you divine from what the premiers are saying they need to hear?
Well, I think he's going to try to turn down the temperature on this. I think that one of the important messages that we've been hearing out of his spokespeople and his team over the last day is really to not react too quickly. Because there is time before these tariffs would come in, and because these tariffs would, in the end, make a relatively small dent in our overall trade with the U.S. So I think the first thing is really to keep things focused on what the scope of the threat actually is, and then I think we're going to see him try to lay out a plan, ultimately, hopefully, towards a deal. But one of the things I think that they haven't done very well so far, and will need to be a part of this, that they need to be speaking to Canadians, particularly in the sectors that have been impacted by tariffs and could be impacted by these new tariffs. We are seeing really, really high rates of unemployment in some of the places that are being deeply impacted. And so far, there have been no special measures from the government in order to support those workers in those communities that are most impacted. So that's a big gap. And I would hope that we would see him speak to that, because the general economic environment that we're in right now that is discouraging investment, that is making hiring less likely for a lot of companies, is really putting a lot of pressure on Canadian families.
Yeah, no, that's for sure. Okay, but look, the federal government has finally released the official text of the deal reached with the United States on the Gordie Howe Bridge, and it doesn't exactly line up with what was said by Prime Minister Mark Carney in the early days. The Prime Minister said Canada's debt would be repaid first, or at least its interest payments will be covered before the U.S. shared toll revenues in this new deal, but there's no mention of interest payments being covered in this new arrangement that covers just the first 15 years. Here's Conservative MP Shuvaloy Majumdar speaking about it earlier.
He has our sympathy when it comes to dealing with a tough and unpredictable negotiator in the United States. He does not have our sympathy for obscuring the facts around the Gordie Howe Bridge, for hiding the details. He's a very smart man who has a background in finance and banking. It's hard for me to believe that him and his finance minister did not know what they were saying at the time, hoping that scrutiny would erode and that ultimately they'd be able to escape the day. Accountability has been won for Canadians today by learning more about the bridge, but it's not a win for Canadians on the terms that should have been made.
Okay, Amanda, I just want to clarify for people because there's been a lot of bouncing back and forth on this, just so they understand. There are two deals now on the bridge. The one with Michigan where you split the tolls 50-50 after everything is paid off, unchanged. That is a revenue split that starts like 50 years from now. This is the first 15 years of operations. And for the people emailing me telling me I'm an idiot because I said revenue and not profit, here's what the text of the agreement says. Canada will provide annual economic participation payments outside of the 2012 Canada-Michigan crossing agreement equal to 50% of net bridge and crossing-related revenues for the first 15 years of fiscal operations of bridge operations. Now, net bridge and crossing-related revenues is all revenues collected with respect to the bridge, less all incurred operating costs of the bridge. So paying the people in the toll booth, snow clearing, things like that, but not your interest payments, not your debt repayment, just the operational costs. So that's what we have, Amanda. It is, it may very well be very little money in the first years, but it is a change. It is we still don't know the dollar amounts, but what do you make of, this is different than what the Prime Minister initially said. How does it play?
This has all been as clear as mud, which is, you know, even everything you just said, it's like gobbledygook. I don't know. Like, this is the problem. The problem is communication, right? We need to clearly communicate what was in the agreement in plain language that people understand. Has the agreement changed? If so, how has it changed? Net, it may not be that much. It may be that you're dealing with maintenance and operating costs, splitting the revenue, and the revenue that's split, that Canadians receive, that Canada receives, goes toward paying the debt first. Okay, fine. But none of that has been clearly communicated. And the problem with this vacuum is that the Conservatives are now filling it, right, and making it into more of a scandal against the backdrop of not even being able to stand and celebrate the opening of the bridge. So it's layer upon layer of challenge. This is one of those rare moments where I think the Carney government has got this wrong, and only from a communication standpoint. I think they clearly need to articulate to Canadians, how has the deal changed, if it's changed at all?
Yeah, Tim, I think it's Amanda's probably right. This is probably, in the big scheme of things, not a lot of cash, but it all goes into a fund that is 100% controlled by the Americans. So it is an absolute concession, but maybe a necessary one, right? Because you don't build this bridge to collect tolls. You build this bridge to move goods and boost trade and have the economic activity. And the longer it's closed, the worse off you are. So you get why they made the choice. Just explain it.
Exactly, and I think, look, the Prime Minister is speaking as if he's in a boardroom and is comfortable talking about deals, but the problem is it isn't a boardroom table filled with CFOs, filled with actuaries, filled with accounting advisors who would get what he's talking about. He's talking to the Canadian public, and when he's doing that, he doesn't come across, at least in this particular arrangement, as being sincere. David, he should have led, and they started to do this at one point, that, you know, doesn't matter what I'm trading off today. It's opening this bridge means X billions of dollars going across that bridge, which is bigger for the whole economy. That's why I'm doing it. Here's what the projections are. They started down that path, but then the Prime Minister seemed to get lost in the finer points of the deal. It's a bit like that whole condo arrangement, which they got themselves in trouble for early on, too, when the Prime Minister talked about what he was doing. And it took them 3 days to clarify that because, again, you had the boardroom bookkeeper speak, which Canadians like about the Prime Minister. They like his boardroom background, but the boardroom style of communication is not political communication, and they got to up their game on that, or they will at some point get themselves into trouble.
That's a good point. Jordan, because you're in charge, we're out of time. I'm going to give you the last word, and then we're going to say goodbye.
Well, I think the real test of whether or not you have a communications problem is, would we be talking about this if the Prime Minister had simply expressed what the terms of the agreement were when he was initially asked? And we wouldn't be. What has become a story is that he really very clearly indicated one thing when it wasn't the case. And I think that this is probably, you know, from the Liberals' perspective, a really unfortunate use of his capital. He has a lot of trust of Canadians, that he's a good manager, that he's straightforward, that he's not a politician, he's a straight shooter. And that has been a bit squandered here. I don't think it's the end of the world. The important thing is the bridge is getting opened. But this is a hit that was really unnecessary for him.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. The little details can be the things that get you sometimes. Amanda Alvaro, Tim Powers, and Jordan Leibniz, we're out of time. Thank you all. Great to see you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.